Welcome back to Theya. Today we have a very special guest, Mr. Peter St. Onge. He is a heritage economist and former professor, and obviously Twitter extraordinaire. Many of you will recognize him. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Joe. It's great to see you again.
Absolutely, likewise. It's always a great conversation with you. When it comes to econometrics, you have your ear to the ground more than most people, so I always love having you on to chat about what you're seeing and all the lies that you're observing.
Yeah.
First things first, I guess, right off the bat, you wrote a piece a few days ago called Killing the Golden Goose, and you opened it up talking about how 80% of baby boomers were earning more than their parents. By Gen X, it was 60, and millennials, it's barely 50. Who knows what it is for people my age, probably far worse.
Yeah.
I'm going to pull up
Yeah.
the chart in a second, but why on earth is this happening? What's going on here?
Yeah, it's really kind of a big deal that 80% for the boomer generation, right? And what we're talking about there is that boomers, when they were 30 years old, all right, 80% of them were making more than their parents, the silent generation. All right, and that's pretty much the pattern in the United States since freaking Jamestown. I mean, like since 1620. All right, because that's been the pattern for the Industrial Revolution in the West, is that each generation is just astoundingly richer than their parents. Yes, you got a bunch of idiots who fall off the wagon. That's that 20% of losers. But 80% basically means every single generation is doing a lot better than their parents. And indeed, that's kind of the stereotype, is that grandparents sit around and they say, you guys have it so easy. You've got all this opportunity. If I could only dream of all these wonderful things you guys have. And that's been the reality for 300, 400 years now in this country. And we broke it. And so now we're at this stage where just barely half of millennials are doing better than their parents. So putting differently, as a whole, millennials are doing no better than their parents. If 50% are doing better, 50% are doing worse. We have broken the golden goose. We are no longer living in an economy where the pie is getting bigger, where every generation is doing better than their parents. And so then at that point, we ask why? How did we break it? And, a couple of usual suspects come to mind. I think the important thing to remember is that when we're talking about this kind of sort of giant shift, right? I mean, really what we're kind of talking about is gutting the Industrial Revolution, right? Canceling the enormous increase in human prosperity that came about beginning with the Industrial Revolution. Now, why did that happen in the first place? The sort of spark was cheap fossil fuels, but the gasoline was really property rights, right? Between constitutions, sort of a legacy of feudalism that led to constitutional monarchies. In the West, they had built up this, not necessarily unique, but rare blend of property rights where when you combine that with the opportunities that came from cheap fossil fuels, steam power essentially, it set off. If you look at a chart of human prosperity going back, 10,000 years, it's like a hockey stick, right? It's just absolutely flat. You have these little fluctuations, and then it just absolutely soars. That's what the Industrial Revolution achieved. And what they've managed to do between, in my opinion, the disasters of 1913, meaning the income tax and, of course, the Federal Reserve, central banking more broadly, the government takeover that really kicked off with World War I. You could argue it started about the 1870s under Bismarck's model, which was imported to the U.S., which basically said that the government knows best and the government's going to control everything. That started off this process that was relatively slow. It took a while to kill things. Thank you. That's a great chart right there. Bingo. Right? Flat line, and then it absolutely takes off. So it took them a while to kill it, but the key here is that year by year, right? If you look at something like the number of regulations, for example, in existence in the U.S., it is straight line up, right? It's thousands of new regulations every single year. They just pile on top of each other. And, people have been warning really for 100 years since, 1913. People have been warning that we're going to kill the golden goose. It looks like they are finally managing to do it. It took a while, but we're here now at this point. If we look, even just zooming in the past 20 years, if you look at productivity, for example, which basically measures social prosperity, productivity has halved since the year 2000. Okay, so it's not like this came out of the blue, right? I mean, we've had a lot of warning here. There's been a process that's going on decade after decade. And finally, we've reached the point now where apparently we've broken it. The young generations are no longer wealthier than the older generations. And, you can see it. You mentioned Zoomers. We don't have data on them yet because they're not 30 years old, right? But if you look at Zoomers, I mean, you see people where, you see like videos on TikTok where they're just absolutely astounded. They're like, how did my parents or my grandparents do it, right? How did they own a house? How did they survive on one income? How do they send like 3 or 4 kids to school, to college on a single income, right? Mom was staying home. She was doing the Tupperware parties and she was serving Kool-Aid to the kids.
And Dad somehow worked
right?
at the Ford plant and they had 4 kids.
Yeah, right. Yeah, he was doing, a blue collar job and they had a nice quality of life. They would go down to the beach on the weekends. They would raise the kids, send them to college. So how in the heck did they do this? Now you got millennials here, they're spending $70 on like one day's grocery. From their perspective, they just got to run to keep up. Now, a lot of that is self-inflicted. Many of them might have degrees that are utterly useless. Maybe they should have just gone into the trades and gone into work a lot earlier. But the moral of the story here is that if you take, say, Gen X or millennials, a lot of us screwed up like that too. And we still made it out in pretty good shape. Most of us still did better than our parents because that fundamental economy was not broken.
Absolutely. And there's a point that I want to jump off to. You had another tweet talking about credit card delinquency rates. It kind of plays into the whole idea of people needing to stretch themselves in order to make ends meet. They're now at an all-time high at small banks, and they're now double their rate that they were at large banks. Would it be safe to say that people are just buying now and paying later, and that's how they're that's how they're bridging this gap between what they're earning and what they have to be spending in order to survive?
Yeah, that's what seems to be happening. So there's been data on so-called doom spending, where especially young people, they're sort of giving up on building anything for the future, right? They're giving up on buying a house. They're giving up on starting a family. They're basically resigned to living with roommates at age 40, eating ramen, and instead they're spending their money on, cruises to the Bahamas or, flashy sneakers, like things that don't have any earning potential for the future. They're essentially living for the day. And we're seeing that in debt levels. We're seeing it, I've got a video upcoming talking about shadow debt, this buy now, pay later. So by one estimate, that's about $700 billion in buy now, pay later, and that does not show up in the statistics. That's not tracked under traditional credit tallies. There is a bunch of debt in there that, fundamentally where this is coming from is young people giving up hope. They don't see a point in building for the future. They may as well just wait for the moment. And, I think that the experience since COVID sort of trained them to think that they can just kind of sit tight, look pathetic, and the more pathetic they are, the more likely that somebody's going to parachute in and do something for them, right? It could be stimulus checks. It could be universal basic income. It could be this debt forgiveness. Maybe that'll spread and morph into UBI because UBI is a fantastic vote buyer. So I think that a lot of young people have almost been trained into thinking, there's a lot of value to looking pathetic because somebody will parachute in and rescue you. Now, of course, the problem is that if you look at the fiscal situation of the country, we have a finite number of those rescues that can come in, right? We're pushing $35 trillion in debt. We're at $1.3 trillion in debt interest, right? Which not very long ago, that was the entire federal budget was $1.3 trillion. I think if you go back to Clinton, it might have been around that. Right. So, I mean, these are just absolutely astounding numbers. They are draining the Treasury as fast as possible to buy elections and to try to goose the economic numbers. And my concern is that you've got tens of millions of young people who are sitting around essentially counting on that as their retirement account, right? Counting on the fact that sooner or later some Joe Biden version 2.0 is going to come in and buy their vote. And that ability is rapidly evaporating.
Hope is not a strategy. That's the best way of putting it, I think.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's not a strategy. And of course, the risk is that if the hope substitutes for the hard work, then at the end of the day, these people are going to be left with nothing. You know, you're going to have people who grew up in middle-class families who had every advantage given to them, and they managed to squander it all. It is the prodigal son given the world, and they end up with absolutely nothing. So we've, you know, between the education system, between those kinds of sort of motivation draining handouts, you know, the PPP loans that went to people who are not afraid of prosecution, whereas hardworking people did not get the free money. We've just got this massive erosion of motivation across the entire country, and a huge amount of that is being driven by the federal government.
Very well said. I want to take a small detour and I guess ask about, not a detour necessarily, but kind of an aside. One of the other charts that you posted, and you briefly spoke about it there for a second, most unmarried young adults say that they'd like to marry someday, and only about half of both men and women who don't have children say that they want to. This is adding to the fact that when they end up having children, instead of having big families, 4, 5, 6, as many as God blesses them with, they end up having 1 or 2 at the very most. That can't be a very good thing given where our deficit is, given where our unfunded liabilities are, and given the fact that we need productivity to increase in order to fix those things. So what are your, and right now we're birthing at like 1.6 births per woman. So our population is going to decline over the next, several decades. So how does, I guess, what are your thoughts on all this? What are your thoughts on the fact that we're having less children? We need productivity to rise to pay for these things, but we aren't. So how are we going to pay for all of it?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So that makes it a lot worse, right? It would be one thing if we were simply getting poorer. You know, our quality of life would gradually decline. Maybe we'd look like Japan has been for the past couple of decades. But at this point, it looks like we're going full on where Japan is going in the future, which is people are just vanishing, and a lot of those programs become unsustainable. The alleged solution of importing random low-skill foreigners, of course, makes it worse because those people consume much more resources than they produce. So it's beefing up the numbers, but it's actually making the fiscal crisis worse. And you know, you've really only got 2 solutions, right? One of them, as you point out, is that you raise productivity, so you get people back to work, you get government out of the way. You know, if you look at the way that the economy used to work, say before 1913, it was extraordinarily easy to start a business. Many families did. Arguably, the majority of families had, side gigs, had little businesses on the side. When I grew up in Philly in the 1970s, you would have a lot of people who, they would cook dinner on Sunday, and then they would basically just put out a sign saying what they cooked. And then if you wanted to come in, you could eat the leftovers, and, you would pay whatever it was back then, $5 or something. And I mean, today, of course, you could never do that, right? If you put a sign in front of your kitchen inviting people to come pay for dinner, holy moly, how many inspectors are you going to have in there? Right. So we've strangled that sort of informal economy that I think used to sustain a lot of people and used to increase productivity. And we could get away with it for a while there because we were still running on fumes. But at this point, they've strangled the formal economy. The formal jobs are not paying what they used to. They're not even keeping up with inflation. But they've also, in the meantime, strangled this sort of informal. So you put those together, and unless we fix one or both of those, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. Of course, the other way to do it, if they can't fix productivity, is to encourage people to have more children. I think they've got a lot of work ahead of them. If you look historically at why people have kids in the first place, one reason is as a retirement account. So if you're in many parts of Africa, for example, if you don't have kids, you are going to starve in your retirement. You're going to be eating garbage. Another reason, of course, is child labor. Children are very, very hardworking. If you live on a farm, then children can basically pay for themselves within about 3 years. So the burden is much smaller. I think a third part of it is also that a lot of people have kids for companions, right? I mean, a kid is a it's better than having a sibling. I mean, kids are just awesome. However, I think that public schools in many ways almost focus on alienating kids from their parents. You saw it during the pandemic where, there was a standard joke people had where, oh, now that I have to spend all my time with my kids, I realize how much I can't stand them. That is not natural. Like, for people to not be able to stand their kids is absolutely not natural. It's not how humans have been for millennia. You have it on the other side, too, where kids sit around and complain about their parents. That's also not natural, right? Kids and parents are supposed to be on the same side. They're supposed to be best friends. So I think in many ways, the attractions of kids, right? A retirement account, being able to pay their own way, being a lifelong companion, a loyal friend. The government has just absolutely targeted every single one of those to dissuade people from having kids. So I think that if we get the government out of all three of those, I think that we substantially reverse it. Worst case scenario, the government screws it up so bad that society collapses, at which point people go back to having 7 kids. So either way, the problem solves itself. But it'd be nice to do it the easy way and not the hard way.
It would. And I think at the end of the day, it is a pretty big white pill, what you just said there. Because if you look back at the Great Depression, too, I mean, people were having 5, 6, 7 kids. Money, people, humanity finds a way, right, at the end of the day. And so
yes.
For any people watching, I wouldn't put off having a family or have the idea of put off having a family just because you're not financially where you want to be. You're never going to be. You're never going to feel ready. And so it is heartwarming to know that even if the apocalypse were to come, we'd still be able to be fruitful and multiply.
Well, that Joe, so that's a really important point, and that's actually borne out in the data. Okay, if you have a kid and you're thinking you can't afford the kid, a magic transformation overcomes, especially men, where before the kid, one more round of Assassin's Creed is pretty much an addiction, can't tear yourself away. When you've got a kid and you're facing the prospect of not being able to feed the kid, there is a magical transformation. And the end result is that men earn tons more after they have kids. The kid more than pays for itself in motivation. So and in my case, that was true. Before I had kids, I was goofing around, hanging out on beaches and cruising the third world. And then once I had kids, I thought, I got to get my crap together. And it's a magical transformation. So anybody listening who's on the fence, just have the kids. You'll be shocked at the motivational transformation that you undergo.
Amen. Phenomenal. Thank you for that, Peter. So shifting gears here to financial markets, I suppose. I mean, we know who's responsible for prosperity shrinking, right? It's government intervention. It's a function of the Fed stealing people's purchasing power. And recently, you just published a video, I think it was today actually, about the Fed announcing more inflation. So they announced that they'd be slowing the pace of their balance sheet runoff. So they're slowing the rate at which assets are coming off their balance sheet. What are the implications for this as far as price inflation goes? Because clearly you could see in this chart they haven't been able to do it very effectively before without having to come back in.
Yeah, so, if you look at it sort of top down, just kind of to get a scale of what we're talking about here. So what the Fed announced is that they're going to decrease the roll-off by $35 billion a month. That's effectively printing $420 billion a year. Okay, it's taking 420 of already printed money, which is a great number for Elon. It's leaving that in the economy, whereas their previous plan was to drain that money out and basically cancel it. Right. So if you take 420 billion, divide that by the money supply at the moment, you're talking about 2%. Okay, so just sort of the naive top down, you would say, well, that's about 2.5 or 2% in additional inflation that the Fed is promising. Now, of course, it doesn't quite work that way. Money, it's sticky, it gets saved. The vast majority of money at any given moment is not actually in circulation, it's being saved somewhere. So, I mean, it doesn't translate one for one. But the point here is sort of on a grand scale, this is quite an enormous amount of money. And it's different than how the Fed usually makes easy money, right? Usually the Fed lowers interest rates in order to basically encourage banks to create more money through loans. That's normally what drives inflation. In this case, they're going ahead and effectively printing up the money directly by slowing the roll-off. Now, why are they doing it this way? Because it targets government cost of borrowing fundamentally, right? So right now the Fed is running, I think it's 1.3 or 1.7, changes constantly, but they're running a very large deficit at the moment. It's on track towards 2 trillion. They might not hit it this year, but almost certainly they will next year. So they've got 2 trillion in additional debt that they're trying to sell every year. And meanwhile, a lot of the buyers are dropping out, right? So, China for sure is trying to insulate itself from any future problems with the U.S. You've got other countries that they're nervous about what the U.S. just did to the Russian central bank that seized their dollars. So a lot of countries are saying, whoa, the dollar is a risky asset. We got to pull out of it. You're seeing that in gold prices, right? Gold prices are going up because central banks are getting out of dollars and they're getting into things like gold. So if your buyers are leaving and you've got this huge flood of 2 trillion deficits coming out, then who the heck's going to buy this stuff? And so the Fed took a look at that, in my opinion, and they said, all right, we got to stop rolling off our assets, right? In other words, when our government debt comes due, we got to go ahead and buy new ones to replace them because there's got to be some buyer in this market. If not, then treasury yields could start to rise. That's already been a concern. There's been a lot of chatter, including studies by the Federal Reserve, that's been asking whether there is some kind of risk premium attached to treasuries. And if that narrative, I think, starts getting legs, that is something that I think scares Janet Yellen and Jerome Powell, because that would suggest that the bond vigilantes may be coming back to life. In other words, that markets may be refusing to buy all of this U.S. debt, perhaps because they're concerned that it won't be repaid in the future, or alternatively, they're concerned that the government will inflate it all away. Either way, that'll hit their holdings.
Very well said. And one of those entities that's on the brink of divesting from USTs, and pardon me for scrolling through all of my charts, it's Japan. Japan very recently today, they just announced, tentatively, I suppose, the United States and Japan are talking about potentially intervening in foreign exchange markets in order to backstop the yen. Now, this comes as Japan has $1.1 trillion of USTs. Do you think that, obviously the balance sheet roll-off was something that was announced a little while ago, but do you think that this announcement that the United States would be helping Japan is to prevent it from dumping these USTs and making the government interest problem even worse?
100%. Yep, I think you're absolutely right. Japan just did an intervention on the yen. The yen's been collapsing all this year. It's down about a third, which is a pretty epic move for the yen. This is not Argentina. And Japan had, they jumped in and did an intervention, last week, I think the 29th and the 1st. And they spent about $55 billion on that. And they barely moved the yen. I think it started at 159 and then, right now it's 156. They barely moved it for $55 billion. The thing is, people estimate, UBS, the Swiss bank, estimates that Japan's only got about $300 billion in cash to use on these kinds of interventions, and after that, they've got to dip into their treasuries and start selling those off. So if they just blew 1/6 of that, moving the yen 3 points, then I think absolutely the Treasury is interested in, how many months Japan has left before it's going to have to start selling off its treasuries. And, Japan, I think, is just, it's a losing battle at this point. I think the most that Japan can hope for is to slow the fall of the yen. I don't think they can actually stop it. And the reason they can't stop it is because fundamentally Japan can't raise interest rates anywhere close to the U.S. level. And they can't do that because their economy is too weak. Their economy has, it's sort of like a hothouse orchid. Like it can only survive in a greenhouse. It can't actually survive in the outside, meaning it can only survive at roughly 0% rates. If Japan, I think, tries to raise rates to 2 or 3%, it'll have a catastrophe. Japanese government is already deeply unpopular. The approval ratings on the Kishida cabinet are something like 26%, right? So there's no way that Japan can raise rates. Meanwhile, if they can't raise rates, right now you're looking at 0% rates in Japan, 5% rates in the U.S. Well, that means that, like, if you're a bank or a pension fund, your yen assets are earning roughly 0%, why don't you sell those and go buy a bunch of U.S. assets that are paying 5%, right? I mean, that's just free money. And so that's what's happening. It's going to continue happening as long as there's that interest rate differential. And so if you've got trillions flooding out of Japan into U.S. markets, that's going to collapse the yen. The only way to fix that fundamentally, these little currency interventions are just, I mean, they're just sideshows. They're absolute waste of money. The only way to fix that is that Japan has to be able to raise its interest rates. And the only way it can do that is by having an absolutely catastrophic purge of all these crappy malinvestments that have been built up over, 35 years of zero interest rates.
For sure. And to a lesser degree, I think that also is the solution for the globe. Obviously, in this case, we're talking about interest rate differentials that are crushing the yen. But I do think that ZIRP and its ilk, and here, let me unshare this chart because we're not talking about it anymore. But I think ZIRP and its ilk have kind of created so much malinvestment globally that really the only way to fix this and course correct it is a devastating, sweeping purge of all that malinvestment.
Yep.
The positive real rates for decades maybe, and a huge multi-year recession that nobody wants. That will be absolutely devastating, but really it's the only way to fix it. It's either that or we just continue down the path that we're headed and prices continue outstripping wages and you continue seeing people who have assets outpace people who don't. Do you think globally the solution has to be ponying up and being austere and having a awful multi-year recession? And if that is the only solution that's facing the world, do you think that we're ever going to do that?
Yeah, so that kind of brings us back to the 50% of millennials that we kicked off with, where, you've got two paths you can choose here. One of them is to purge all of the malinvestments, purge the garbage, and then get our economy back to something that's, actually productive. And you're absolutely right. That would take positive real rates for quite some time. The alternative, of course, is what they're doing, right? Which is that they are staving that off. They're kicking the can, trying to buy one more day of this Potemkin economy that we have. And what that ends up costing you is the entire world, the entire Western world is now becoming Japanese, right? Our productivity is melting away. We're becoming this sort of moribund economy that just sort of slowly dribbles into poverty. Now, the difference is that in Japan, they spent a lot of government money, but because Japanese saved so much, that didn't actually bleed out into CPI-type inflation. In the West, they're spending actually even more. I don't know about more. Japan spent quite a bit. But I think at this point, our budget deficit is something like 6 or 7% of GDP, which is pretty much unprecedented outside of war. And so that then creates this this sort of pile-on effect where not only is the economy slowing, not only is productivity melting away, but you've got this massive government spending that is both hiking inflation and, of course, the question is always, what is that government spending going towards, right? It's hiring bureaucrats who actually slow, who end up putting like chains on the productive economy. It's bidding resources away from the productive economy, so workers, steel, resources. If we look, for example, just kind of to paint a picture of exactly how this process works. So a couple of years ago, the U.S. government came out with this infrastructure deal, and I can't remember the exact number. I think it was $800 billion. Anyway, it was a large infrastructure deal. And in the, one of the things that they were going to do was to tear down racist overpasses, right? Overpasses that were built too low so that buses couldn't get through them. Yeah, and these were perfectly functioning highways, but they had things like that, and the money, the vast majority of the money, did not actually go for the kind of infrastructure that Americans care about. Things like train bridges falling down, went to solar panels and pretty much what you expect. But the thing is, all of that infrastructure money. So that was going to hire construction workers and steel. The thing is, at that time, we had this massive supply chain snarl, right? Where the warehouse vacancy rate in LA was under 1%, right? If you imagine a parking lot, you're trying to park your car, and out of the 100 spots in the lot, only one of them are free. It's going to take you some time to park your car, right? 1% is pretty rough. And indeed, you had all these brokers and importers in LA who were just on the phone all day long trying to find some empty warehouse space. So the problem, of course, is the workers and the steel that could build warehouses instead was bid away by government waving these giant $800 billion checks and pulling it all over to rebuild racist overpasses. So the issue, part of it is the enormous spending, but a huge chunk of it is then what does government do with all of that money that it's spending, right? And this is a very sort of Austrian way of looking at it, where we tend to look at the real economy, right? The economy is not made of dollars. The economy is made of resources, right? It's made of people who are actually useful, who can build things or can accomplish things. It's built of physical resources, things like steel, trucks, right? Like things that are actually useful as opposed to paper. And across the board, if it were just government handing out stimulus checks, then yeah, you'd be mostly talking about inflation. The problem here is that a lot of what government is doing, it's not handing out stimulus checks. It's more harmful than that. It's actually building things, generally things that should never be built. But what that does is doubles the damage, right? Not only are they pumping out all this money, but they're actually taking resources from the productive sector, shrinking the economy.
It's a very big problem. So I suppose then I do want to ask you about Joe Biden, just a couple more things to talk about. And I do want to hit on this. Joe Biden's chief economist, or one of the federally funded economic consulting firms, the chief of that, he had no idea how government debt works. When asked the simple question of how government debt is issued, asked the question of why can't we just print the currency rather than issuing debt in the currency in order to fund ourselves, and he couldn't answer it. So I think the simple question I'd like to ask you is, do any of our leaders know what they're doing? And if it's not incompetence, is it malice, or is it some combination of the two?
Yeah, so the guy in question is Jared Bernstein, and he's the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. And they're supposed to be like basically the Jedi Council or the Brain Trust who, advises the government on the economy. These guys are supposed to be the gurus on the mountain, right? You've got other economists like the White House chief economist and whatnot. Those guys, it's understood, those guys are more kind of political. The CEA is supposed to be the god. And right, in that interview, I mean, this guy apparently has no idea how money works. He has no idea how debt works. He literally was thinking that government, issues bonds in order to lend money, which of course debt is for borrowing money, as many people know. I mean, the guy's just absolutely clueless. And so, right, to your question of is it malice or idiocy, the vast majority of these guys, they get where they are in the administration because they're ideological diversity hires, right? They say the right things. They believe the right things. They are not chosen for their expertise. Bernstein, I think his PhD is like in social work or something, right? So you might ask, why is he leading the Council of Economic Advisors? You've got a lot of these characters just across the board. And what unites a lot of them is belief in so-called modern monetary theory, MMT, which is just, there's nothing modern about it. It's a centuries-old inflationism. It was popular in the 1700s, the 1800s. It basically says the government should spend everything possible because the government is wise and it's good at making us rich. Of course, we have the Soviet Union. We have many, many examples that say that that is not true, that government should not be printing money and trying to direct the economy. But anyway, you can understand why MMTers are popular in a left-wing Biden administration. So I don't think it's exactly malice per se. I think these people are brainwashed into this worldview where, I think fundamentally the metaphor for them is a classroom where you have a teacher and then you've got students. And in their mind, the students are like psychopathic, just, scary people. And the teacher is kind of the wise overlord who, has the wise guidance that stops them from killing each other, but, gets them to brush their teeth and to do something useful in their life. And in their mind, the government is the teacher and the people are the children. And I think that all the rest of it follows from that. So is it malice? I mean, a lot of the policies that they come out with end up being pretty malicious. I don't think they're motivated by malice. I think that that's just their worldview, that government is this wise overlord. And for some reason, you talk to them about the Soviet Union and just the penny doesn't drop. You talk to them about, government-led programs here that they constantly fail. If you take something like the war on poverty, quote unquote, the 1960s Lyndon B. Johnson program that was supposed to rescue the inner city. And of course, everything got worse. The family completely imploded. Inner cities became dangerous. At this point, you can walk around inner cities and you've got like a gas station and like one Chinese takeout, when like you used to have this whole row of small businesses that were thriving. You had a theater, you had the fruit guy, you had the flower shop. All that stuff is gone. And so you can show them, you can say, well, look, we've tried government and this is what you get. And somehow the penny doesn't drop. I think that's probably more because of the education system, which has basically become a socialist madrasa, sort of training the next generation to become foot soldiers of the revolution. But in terms of, I think the people who go through it are more just brainwashed. So I guess we'd put that in the idiot category. The people who designed it, I think, were absolutely malicious. Those were people like Thomas Dewey, the progressive cabal who gathered around Herbert Hoover back around World War I. I think those guys were absolutely malicious, but unfortunately, here we are 100 years later living with the consequences of their interventions.
Indeed. And I've got one last big question for you. So Joe Biden tweeted out yesterday that Medicare is stronger and Social Security remains strong. And I replied, and it's tough to see right here, but my full reply was that we have no money to pay for Social Security or Medicare. So instead, we're leaving an $80 trillion debt hole for our grandchildren to fix. And it is a chart released by the Department of the Treasury. Now, this was 2 years ago. It's probably much worse today. This was 2 years ago. It shows over the next 75 years our spending versus our revenue. And we have an $80 trillion hole made up almost entirely by Social Security and Medicare, and money that isn't coming in because of the demographics of the country and where they're headed. What on earth are we doing to fill this gap? This unfunded obligations gap, and I suppose to be actionable for the people listening, how can they insulate themselves from what the government and the Fed are doing in order to try and fill this gap?
Yeah, so the unfunded liabilities, they just keep getting bigger. And, of course, every so often Congress steps in and makes them more generous because it always looks good when you promise people free stuff. And anything free, if you have free gender transitioning or whatever, well, okay, that costs money. And if you're promising to do that forever and ever, then you have to multiply that by a whole bunch of years. And so, very quickly everything gets into the trillions. So, I've seen various estimates, 80 trillion, 110 trillion, 160 trillion. At any rate, it's a ton of money and it's not going to fix itself. You've got two realistic outcomes. One of them is that they hike taxes massively. Of course, if you do that, then you shrink the economy almost as massively. You sort of have to run on a treadmill. You have to keep raising taxes. The economy shrinks. Now you got to raise taxes some more and so on. So that's pretty much the road to oblivion. The other way that's a little bit more positive is that you basically have the mother of all cage fights, where if you hold the line on the taxes, right? That was Ronald Reagan's Starve the Beast. Okay, just hold the line on the taxes. Yeah, Washington is going to do whatever it's going to do, but hold the line on the taxes. And you get this very pleasing scenario where Social Security and Medicare, which are among the two most popular programs in the entire country, actually, I think they universally top the list. You just let them engage in this beautiful gladiatorial cage fight where they suck everybody else's budget. So they defund the EPA, they defund the wars, they defund everything else because it's all being sucked into this giant vortex of Social Security and Medicare. I think realistically that's the only possible solution here. And it's not altogether bad, but it does mean that, don't necessarily waste your arrows fighting over Social Security. Focus them on holding the line on taxes. As long as you can hold the line on taxes, you want that cage fight to happen. So at least there is some countervailing force in Congress stopping them from spending everything they can. Now, in terms of how you protect yourself, one way is, of course, you probably don't want to count on Social Security. You may not even be able to count on Medicare. Constantly in any kind of discussions on how to fix those programs, pretty early in the process, they start talking about kicking rich people off. Rich, of course, is a movable feast. They'll tend to move that down more and more. So, 100,000 to be rich, and then 80,000 and 60,000 and so on. So I think it's probably prudent to assume that you're not going to get the whole deal on those. And so you've got to put more effort into your own assets. So, stocks, housing holds up reasonably well. And of course, assets that are specifically designed to protect against inflation, such as Bitcoin or gold. If you've got a nice mix of those in your portfolio, then you should be able to survive. But I think who's really going to be hurting is the lower middle class, the middle class. They're not going to get taken care of. They're not really first in line for the vote buying. And we're already seeing those people are really hurting the most. People like truck drivers, small business owners, people who run restaurants. I think they're absolutely going to get wrecked in the meantime. And so those people really need to look after their assets.
Absolutely. Allocate to assets, hold them tightly. If you already are, do what you can to increase your allocations, because we know that, we're not going to raise taxes and cut spending at the same time. Nobody will vote for that. The politicians that do it, they'll never get elected again.
Yep.
At the end of the day, people vote for free money, free programs. So allocating to the assets that appreciate in the face of all of that is the best that anyone can do.
Yep, absolutely.
Wonderful. Peter, it's been excellent, as always. You were a wealth of knowledge. I love sitting down and talking with you and getting your perspective on things. Where can people find you?
Let's see. I'm over on X as Prof. St. Onge, and I've also got a Substack, peterstantonge.com, and a weekly podcast where I round up all the daily videos at, where is that? peterstantonge.com.
Excellent. I'd highly recommend it. I know for a fact that most people watching this already know of you, but if you do want some deprogramming, Peter St. Onge is easily the best account on Twitter to do that. Once again, thanks for coming on, man.
All right. Yeah, it's always a pleasure, Joe, and thank you for the kind words. I appreciate that.
Hold that thought. Before you go, make sure you download the Theya app. It is now live on the iPhone App Store, and it's very simple. It's self-custody simplified. You can set up a Bitcoin vault, whether you want to use 1 key or 3 keys, depending on your saving objectives. It is the simplest way to self-custody. Now live in the App Store. Go download it, check it out, let us know what you think, and we'll talk to you soon.